So I was challenged by a gentleman at my local gaming group about 5 years ago to make a simple foam building, something that can be used for both tabletop and D&D and Warhammer, just something to get the point across that this is a building here or that this is cover and so on and so forth. And I like what I had at the time. This was really good considering I'd never tried something like this before. However, I was never quite happy with it. Now, recently, with me being on TikTok a lot, I have stumbled across a mad genius who makes foam buildings so beautifully and so intricate with playable interiors. And they have inspired me to try again. Now, today's video doesn't have a playable interior. I have a creative workaround for that. However, I learned enough that I think with my second attempt, I may actually try to use a playable interior. But for now, let's see how I improved upon this design with today's video. Now, unfortunately, it is not a tutorial. However, I will be explaining as much as I can as we go along through the build process so that if you'd like to attempt to follow along at home, you are more than welcome to. And I encourage you that even if you don't think you've got the skills to do something like this, if you have the extra material, to just give it a shot, even if it's just this simple, just so that you can say you've done it. Or if you want to try to go as complicated or more so than what I have in today's video, go for it. Shoot for the moon. Let's get on with today's video. So I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted, so I went online, I found a template, and then I'm using this as my basic measurements. I've kind of rounded things out so the interior size should be a playable size should I want to replicate the interior rather than using theater of the mind. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to use this metal ruler and an X-Acto blade to cut this out. You could use a hot wire cutter, whatever the case may be. And then I got out a miniature to use as a size reference. And you can see I'm just taking her and I'm measuring her. You could measure against centimeters or inches. I end up going against inches. My initial plan for how high I wanted the walls to be didn't work out quite right, so I ended up going with about 2.5 inches on the total height of the wall. So when I go to cut out my foam core later, I cut it significantly shorter than this because I'm planning to add bricks to the bottom. What I should have done is I should have cut out the foam core for the total height and then sliced my bricks down to add them as a facade on the surface of that foam core. That's where I kind of went wrong with whether or not I should have a playable interior or not. In the future, if I do this again, I'll go ahead and add my wood grain texture to my base plate, and then I will cut the foam to match and make sure that my walls are plenty high, also making sure that I account for how thick my floor is going to be. In this case, I cut out a single piece and then I cut across the middle with a hot wire foam cutter. So my first step was to cut out all of my individual walls. Now again, I should have made these much taller, but I didn't. I went ahead and I cut all those out, and now I'm doing my best to glue them all onto that base plate. Now I did add the measurements to the sides to ensure that it would equally cover both the foam core walls as well as my base plate. Meaning that since my base plate is 3 inches wide on one side, I ended up adding about 1/4 inch to my measurement to make sure that it would cover up the foam core walls that I would end up adding to both sides. A change that I would consider making here would be to go ahead and cut things at a 45-degree angle and to make sure that everything is plenty wide to ensure that there is no open face side on the outside of the building, meaning that there is no exposed foam and it's just paper. However, you could also end up using a step later that we end up using to cover up the foam core regardless, so that 45-degree cut may be useless. It's up to you to decide. In the beginning here, I used a lot of super glue to go ahead and kind of secure everything together. I end up having problems later on with the blue foam as it does eat into the foam when I use my accelerator. The accelerator basically kicks off the drying process much faster, generating heat, which was causing the foam to melt. So please be conscious of that when doing this. I would recommend using a hot glue gun or using pinning. meaning to use a metal pin, either a sewing needle or something, to hold it all together while PVA glue sets and then removing the metal pins. That's going to be a much slower process in building, it'll be a little safer, and you won't have to worry about your project just melting out from under you from the super glue. Now I'm using these tongue depressors as a way to stabilize the build so it doesn't collapse in on itself. The next thing I needed to set out to accomplish was to get rid of these rough edges. I initially thought about cutting out foam pillars, removing a corner, and then gluing them in place to cover up that. I would have to texture that to look like wood, and I thought, well, maybe there's a better way to do that. Turns out I was wrong. I ended up going back to that method. One of the methods I had tried to convince myself would work would be to use coffee stir sticks and to use a wire brush similar to the foam and to rough up the surface. I thought this would allow it to flex a little bit so that if I needed to do something fancy, I could. The reality is that I should have just gone ahead and used the foam to begin with. So here I end up using one of my failed ideas, the coffee stir stick, and I'm using it as a size reference to make sure I cut all my pieces to an approximate size. Now I knew width-wise it could be a little bit wider, so that wasn't a big deal, but I needed the height to be the same so that it would match my walls. I used my wire brush to add a little bit of texture, and then I came in with my X-Acto knife and I cut a little bit away from my edges. This was just to give it a rough hewn shape, make it look like more natural lumber, something that probably was cut out by hand with hand tools. And now I use a X-Acto knife to cut away the corner so that it will fit on the front like a facade. Now you could use a hot wire cutter. In this case, I feel it's so small it would just melt, so it's better to do it with an X-Acto knife. So here you can get a much better example of what I was trying to explain. I've cut out that corner so that I can just glue this in place. That's going to hide that rough foam edge, and it's also going to help hide the corner so that if things don't line up perfect, we can kind of hide that. Now at this point I had built the door off screen, so I knew roughly about how big I needed it to be. I went ahead and spliced my foam where I wanted to put the door, removed the paper, and now it's just a matter of cutting some of this foam away. I only wanted to remove about 50 to 60% of the foam, and this is to make sure that the door sits recessed to make it look like it's a part of the building, but I also wanted it to sit far enough away from the face that anybody sitting at the table could easily identify where the front door of this building was. So I knew I wanted some windows on this build, but I wanted to make sure that they were all the same size, so I needed to make some templates. So one window I wanted 1 inch by 1 inch, the other one I wanted 1 inch by a ½ inch, and so I needed to make some templates to ensure they would always be the same size as well as the same height. So one of my templates ends up being 1 inch by 1 inch and 3/4, and the other one ends up being ½ inch by 1 inch and 3/4. This means that I can measure from the top as well as use them to cross off the top of my window and then cut them out. Now I do end up backing the windows with foam rather than leaving them open, as I wanted to do some really cool ideas with the windows that just didn't work out. I also thought about adding lighting. Again, just didn't work out. I don't think it would look good in this build just because of the way that I built the build, which is why I end up blocking all the windows in so that you can't see in. So once I figure out where the middle of my wall is, I go ahead and use that registration mark that I added to go ahead and line everything up, and then I'm just going to draw out with a pencil where I want my windows to end up. Now you can see I can do 3 sides by doing it this way, and then I can rotate this because I know that my stencil is 1 inch wide, and then I can do that top line, and now I know I have a 1 inch square for my large windows. I can do the same thing with the small template, but use my large template here just to mark out 1 inch tall to make sure that all my windows end up being the same height, regardless of how big my windows end up being in their length. Now some of you may have noticed back when I made the door that the door stuck down farther than the bottom of the walls. That was because I had always intended to put a ring of bricks around the bottom to look kind of like a foundation. Now at this point I've done a jump cut to after I've added those bricks, and shortly after this point I realized I would end up needing to add a second run of bricks. The problem with doing this second run of bricks is it starts to get topsy-turvy, and there's some points where you can see as I'm building where I realize that one of my walls is sitting cockeyed and the whole building doesn't sit quite square anymore, and that's just because of these layers of bricks. I end up fixing that by rubbing it on some sanding paper, but I just wanted to explain what had kind of happened because there is this jump cut, and then I add another layer of bricks again later down the road toward the end of the build, and I don't really explain by showing anything on video. So I ended up deciding that I had one too many windows planned. I figured it was too close to the door, and also these two windows on the outside edge I wish I had put farther in. You'll see why when we go to do framing later, and I definitely could have done the framing better on that back wall than what I did. I had an idea and then I started to glue things down, and then I didn't like the idea. I should have done more test fitting before I started to glue things down, and that was a lesson that I had to learn the hard way. And that's just things that happen when you start scratch building like this. I've not really done a lot of this scratch building before, so I wasn't in the right mindset to think about it. Speaking of not being in the right mindset to think about it, I should have put these triangles in the original design. The roof support should have always been a part of these walls when I cut everything out. But I was so focused on trying to make sure everything was square and that it all lined up that this never even occurred to me until I had gotten to this point in the build. I originally thought I was just going to make the roof as its own piece and then set it in place, and then I started thinking about, well, how on earth am I going to do this? And that was the worst time to start thinking about this. I should have been planning it out from the beginning. At this point, I had been so frustrated, I just wanted to get the roof done, and I just forgot to film. So basically what happened was I got those triangles locked in place. You can kind of see there I'm supporting them with popsicle sticks that are all glued together. And then I'm using some cardstock from some old packaging, and I'm using that to make the base for my roof. Now, it's pretty easy to figure out two rectangles, slap them together, glue them together, but what about this extra little roof piece? Well, I ended up having to cut this stupid little piece about 8 or 9 times before I got the angle right and made it large enough to fit into place. Next time I do something like this, I'm definitely going to have to measure things out, but I'm also going to make it significantly larger than I need to make it and then cut it down once I have it in place. This was a lesson that I definitely learned the hard way, and when I start doing more custom builds and doing more scratch builds in the future, this is a lesson I'm glad I learned now instead of later. It was at this point in the build that I actually started to get quite happy with what I was seeing, but then I realized that I had framed the door and I had framed the corners, but I hadn't really planned to frame anything else. Now, this ended up not being as big a deal with the roof, as I'm able to put some straps of foam up against the corners of the roof as well as along that seam line to kind of help hide everything. But I need to put some framing around the rest of the walls to give that Tudor style feeling that a lot of us tend to expect from fantasy builds. And I happen to be a big fan of that. I know that a lot of the stuff that you can buy has that style, and I wanted my stuff to match with anything I may buy down the road. Now, because I had already done the corners, I didn't feel I needed to show myself putting the framing on. So I went ahead and did all of that off camera. I apologize if that's something you wanted to see. I know this feels like a major jump cut, but honestly it was just cutting strips of foam out with an X-Acto knife and then using the wire brush to texture them. It wasn't rocket science, it wasn't anything wild or crazy, but if you guys are disappointed that I didn't show it, please put a comment down below and I'll do my best to show that the next time I do a build like this. Now, I'm just showing you how I decided to put all my shingles on. I'm using hot glue now. I probably should have switched to super glue at this point. I should have used a gel super glue. As you can see, I'm just fighting with those little wispy bits the whole way. And in the final cut, when you see everything at the end, there's still places where the hot glue just made an absolute mess. I will have fun adding weathering stuff to this later to hide that, but I shouldn't have to do that. And if I had just used super glue during this stage, I wouldn't have that problem. Now, one of the ways I got around doing the top corner of the roof bits was to simply take a piece of my cardstock that I was using for my shingles. Pushing down with the back side of that knife, I can then bend them in half and then glue them down using a bit of hot glue. So after this point in the build, I'd had to walk away for about a day or so, and when I came back to it, this is when I started noticing a lot of the flaws. I really wanted to frame those windows out better, and I didn't really have a good way of doing it without making the sides look cluttered, so this was kind of my best option. Had I glued the bricks to the outside edge, it would have been a lot better than had I done it the way I did it. This would allow me to use much smaller bricks and to do better framing. That's something that I just had to learn the hard way. And then on the back side, you'll see what a bad job I did with the framing. Again, should have brought those windows in closer so that I could have framed out those windows and done a better job at framing. But right now, I'm worried about how am I going to paint this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a coat of Mod Podge with black paint in it. That's the Black Magic Craft Special. Put that all over everything, so that way if I end up using spray paints to paint this, I don't have to worry about it melting. Now when I go to paint this later, I'm probably going to be using a little bit of baking soda and some PVA to give that plaster effect, but for right now this is fine. I'm just going to go ahead and put some surface primer black by Vallejo on the whole thing so you can kind of see it all done up, and then I'll put a gray dry brush just so you can really see it well on camera. This is going to help show some of those flaws so you get a better idea of what I was talking about. As you can see, there's places on the roof where it seems to be an absolute mess, but for the most part, a lot of that wood grain texture that we went out of our way to put on with the wire brush really shows, it really pops. One of the advantages about using cardstock for the roof like this instead of trying to use some really thin foam like I did with my first attempt is it means that no matter how I end up painting this, it'll fit in with the style I need. So if I want to paint them up like wood shingles, I can. If I want to paint them up like slate for a higher end house, I can do that. And it's all still going to look really good. It's going to look really nice. So that's the advantage of doing that versus using the foam where we're going to have big thick tiles and it's going to look like wood. As you can see with my second layer of bricks, it ends up doing a really good job at scaling and to make the whole thing feel unified and make it feel like it's the proper scale for a D&D universe. But it's also large enough that if I put one of my Warhammer figures next to it, you would never know that it's out of scale. It gives a really good job at kind of being multi-purpose like that, so I think I got really lucky there, and I'm very grateful that I kind of figured that out. So what are my big takeaways from this? Number one, mount everything to the outside of the foam, because that is going to be my best bet for if I want a playable interior. And it also means that if I do it that way, I've got some really great places to mount magnets to do a magnetic roof, as well as do some really cool lighting effects in an open window, which I unfortunately can't do with this build, but I'm still excited all the same to get this painted up in a later video. Also, another thing I learned and took away from this, for as much as I may want to just wing it sometimes, I really need to sit down and try to plan some of this out, because otherwise I'm just not going to enjoy the final product as much as I could. I do like this. I am very happy with it. It is significantly better than anything I've done before, but I just look at it and I see all those flaws and I know all the ways to fix it. Does that mean I'm going to get rid of this building when I make the next one? Heck no. I love this. I think it's cool, and it'll definitely have a place on my table for a while. And anyway guys, this video is getting really close to 20 minutes, and I always try to keep these things under 20 minutes at maximum. So at some point I would like to make Troll Skull Manor from Dragon Heist. I think that would be really, really cool to have that as a foam core building that I have made. I think it would make an awesome project, but I'm a long ways away from that. So in the meantime, give me ideas for other builds so I can practice, build up my skills, and then try to do something cool like that. In any case guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you guys so much for all the love and support. And as always, I hope your display case is always filled and your pile of shame never runs empty. Until next time.